All right, so this subunit is going to be the social cost of resource use, and this is going to be the last subunit in the natural resources folder. So then we go on to human impact. So the objectives are going to be to compare and contrast the costs and benefits of using renewables and non-renewable resources, evaluate the consequences of the world's dependence on fossil fuels, and explain how technology can be utilized in resource conservation efforts. So we should know what renewable resources are already, but we will go over them. Benefits of renewable resources, they can be continuously reproduced, so water, solar, air. The only thing is humans can interrupt all of these cycles, really, but the water cycle is a big one that we interrupt. We talked about it in nuclear power, we talked about it in pollution, all that stuff. Whenever we take water out and then don't put it back in the same way that it was before, then we're kind of interrupting the water cycle there. So it doesn't quite go straight back into the system yet. So renewables are replenished by natural cycles, biotic and abiotic, living, non-living. Photosynthesis, that's a big one, and the water cycle. We just talked about the water cycle there. And then some costs of renewables is that they can become non-renewable with human mismanagement. So some good examples of that are plant and animal extinction. Plants and animals are renewable resources, but when we destroy all of them, then we can't use those anymore. So they're non-renewable at that point. Groundwater, deforestation, overgrazing, environmental disasters, all of these things can make renewable resources non-renewable. So just think about that for a little bit. Imagine we have an environmental disaster such as Chernobyl or a nuclear bomb. We get covered in nuclear fallout for 4 years. Sun is no longer a renewable resource. We don't even have it. So, that's just something to think about. Or if that fallout gets into the water system, that's no longer a renewable resource. We can't use it. It's non-renewable at that point. So, what are non-renewables? Benefits of, they're just things that can't be renewed, like gas, oil, that type of stuff. Benefits of non-renewables are fossil fuels are really, really cheap, they're plentiful, and they're readily accessible. So our current modern technologies are well adapted to use fossil fuels. So there's a lot of pushback from a lot of industries that are concerned with change because they're like, well, it's going to cost me money to switch from a fossil fuel generator to a DC to AC generator for solar panels. It's all about the money. That's really all that it's about. So fossil fuels are cheap. That's the number one. Plentiful, so they're not gone yet, and they're readily accessible. So that's what makes them so cheap. Some costs of non-renewables, I think, outweigh the benefits, but that's me personally. Burning of fossil fuels is a cost, so that contributes to global warming, pollution, all that stuff. Humans are using fossil fuels very, very rapidly. So for the past 100 years, we've been sucking out more fossil fuels than is able to be put back in. There are serious consequences to the environmental health and life on Earth. So just really quick ones: acid rain, acidification of the ocean, atmospheric pollution, global warming. All these things are caused by burning of fossil fuels. So using non-renewables. So the benefits are really just money, which isn't even a real thing. And then the costs are we're destroying our one planet that we have to live on. So here's some renewables: solar, water, wind, that can also be turned into non-renewables. And then here's some non-renewables: phosphate, oil, limestone, natural gas, all that stuff. So we need to talk about clean energy sources if we're going to talk about renewables. These are called alternative energies. So they come from renewable resources. They're safe and they're environmentally friendly energy supplies. So we're talking about like solar, wind, geothermal, wave. There's a lot more, like gravity. We use gravity a lot. So there's a need for the industry to make affordable products. That's the only downturn with alternative energies, is the market is not 100% fixed towards alternative energies yet. There's a lot of people clinging on to the fossil fuel, natural resources era, and that's just kind of an old, outdated era. I mean, we need to go forward. So fossil fuels are still cheaper, and that's why we still use them. But if People like you and I can start using more clean energy sources and push that type of a market, then we can very quickly turn into an alternative energy market. We're seeing it in all sorts of places like Asia and Europe. They're pretty much skipping a step and going straight to alternative energy. So here's the biofuel life cycle, and this is just kind of why it costs so much. So we've got this like corn that we use. It's not corn that we eat. It's made specifically to be turned into biofuel. We have to put it in trucks. We have to transport it to a biorefinery. That's got to go through a bunch of processes. It's got to process and convert it into usable energy, and then we have to, put it back into big old tanker trucks, then distribute it to gas stations, and then gas stations can pump it out into your cars. So, it still costs a lot, and there's a few too many steps in this process here to make it affordable. And the other thing is that biofuels still produce CO2. So, the only thing is we're not using non-renewable resources. So we're taking out the fracking, the mining, all that stuff, but it still produces CO2. And then here's renewable energy resources that are changing throughout the world. We've got geothermal, solar hot water, biomass and biofuel. We just talked about that. Small wind turbines, large wind turbines, solar space heating, combined heat and power. So, they're going to get a steam system through here that's going to heat up these pipes. And every time it moves, it's going to turn a generator, or a turbine that turns a generator. Every time it goes into one of these energy states right here, it's going to combine heat and power for you. A lot of big businesses use this. Solar PV, which is photovoltaic, which converts solar energy just straight into energy from DC to AC without using heat. And then we talk geothermal. So let's talk about Chernobyl. Chernobyl was a serious environmental consequence. So April 26, 1986, in Pripyat, Ukraine, it was the worst nuclear power plant disaster in history. Hopefully something like that never happens again, because it was a complete meltdown and a severe release of radioactivity. It was like a mini bomb. So the meltdown happens when the cores get too hot, they overheat, and they start this reaction inside of the nuclear power plant that cannot be stopped, and then it eventually goes and goes and goes until there's no more energy left in that system, and that's heat energy, and that's going to release a lot of radioactivity into the system. So we had a lot of contamination of aquatic systems. 4 square kilometers of pine forest was destroyed, and that's just from the blast. Animals died, they stopped reproducing, or they just altogether left the area. This reproducing and dying is due to mutations from the radioactivity around the power plant. And after 30 years, animals are finally showing signs of returning to the area. So it's not just 30 years and nothing. They've been cleaning that area for 30 years. So it's been 30 years of a lot of cleanup to make animals just finally be able to come back. So they knew. Animals are a lot more sentient than we give them credit for. We were stupid and we stayed there and we exploded a power plant. They knew right away to get out of that area. And they just intrinsically knew. No one was telling them that a nuclear meltdown was happening in the area. They just left. So there's a lot of things that need to be looked at with animals and plants even, and their sentience and our modern understanding of intelligence, because we're kind of constricted with that word intelligence. Because who's more intelligent, the animals that left or the people that stayed? That's an easy one. Okay, so here again is just the effects of radiation of Chernobyl I showed you on the previous slide. So let's talk about our fossil fuel dependence. There's a lot of environmental consequences with that. We've talked and talked and talked about this. Global warming, pollution, even like economic consequences. So we've got some economic concerns. With the rising demand for oil, we have a small increase in global oil production, which is increasing prices, increasing competition, increasing our dependence on foreign oil needs. And that's why we're having all these wars and small conflicts over there. There's a dependence of foreign oil. That fossil fuels hinder development and perpetuate poverty. So with a lack of access to modern energy resources and the rising cost of oil, certain areas are being left behind. And so you see that with like the coal mining areas of Appalachia. They don't have a very good access to modern energy resources or technology or education. And then the rising cost of oil and natural resources is really kind of screwing them over because what they're used to, their lifestyle is kind of having to change. And I feel bad for them, but also it's been 100 years in the making, so it's about time we need to start turning towards more alternative practices. So have those coal miners turn into solar panel electricians, something like that. And then international security, like I said, there's going to be increased competition over scarce resources. This is a quiz question. Make sure you read the quiz question very carefully. It's increased competition over scarce resources of global oil. That's going to increase competition. And then we'll have a need for more foreign oil. So here's the energy consumption from the US in 2014. And you can see right here, these are all the non-renewables. It's about 75% of our power comes from non-renewables. And then this much is nuclear and renewable. So, it's kind of silly. So the global energy policy, our modern global energy policy is a strategy to minimize fossil fuel dependence. We're trying to reduce domestic consumption of fossil fuels, and we're trying to spur a global transition away from fossil fuels and towards sustainable energy sources. So right now, America is pretty much the only country that is not backing this new global energy policy, and it doesn't really make sense economically or environmentally. So, alternative energy technologies. We've got sustainable sources of usable energy. So they're intended to replace fossil fuel sources. They're not going to negate the consequences that have already resulted from burning fossil fuels. So, whatever alternative energies we use, they're not going to sequester carbon. The carbon that's already been emitted is staying up there unless we plant more trees. So that's the example. Carbon dioxide emissions and global warming. That's not just going to miraculously go down with alternative energy technology. We need to stop using them so that the earth can balance itself out. And then here's, temperature change. We already went through this. This is if we go through all of the necessary processes to stop our fossil fuel dependence. And that's a 2-degree temperature rise by 2100. So, this is the best case scenario right here. So we've got some forms of renewable energy. We've got wind power, so that's airflows that are used to run wind turbines. The long-term potential is 5 times greater than that of the total global energy production from fossil fuels, and then 40 times greater if it's used to its furthest extent. So if we use every area that would be good for wind energy to use wind power, we'd have 40 times more electricity in our whole world. Hydropower. It's energy from water. Hydroelectric dams use gravity and the weight of water to spin turbines. So they hold a bunch of water behind something, and then they let it go through the dam, and that's going to have the water go over turbines. It's going to spin the turbines, which generates a generator, which creates electricity. Solar energy is energy derived from the sun via solar radiation. So they're distinguished by the way that they capture, convert, and distribute energy. We have passive solar energy, which they just use the solar energy to warm something up, and then that steam will turn a turbine, which will turn a generator. And then we have active solar energy, which is PV or photovoltaic, which turns sunlight, DC energy, directly into AC energy. And so that goes right into the system. Photovoltaic is really good. We've got biofuels like bioethanol, biodiesel. They're used as fuel or a gasoline additive. So a good example is E85. That's biofuel as an additive, and they're made from plant materials and animal fat. We have geothermal energy, which is from the heat of the Earth's core. It's basically volcanic energy. So a good example is Alaska's largest volcanoes and hot springs have enough geothermal potential to power 25% of the state's needs, and the United States can power 25% of the energy needs if it's utilized to its full extent, geothermal potential. So here's a geothermal power plant. It uses heat to heat up water, which creates steam, which turns a turbine, which turns a generator, goes into a cooling tower, and then it cools the water back into the groundwater system. So that is going to be it. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, make sure you let me know. Otherwise, have a wonderful week.